So Colin, welcome. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everybody. So apologies if I stumble a little bit. I put this together today, got really busy. So thanks for being a patient, willing audience. All right, so who am I? My name is Colin Vallance. I work for a company called CDW. We are a technology services and hardware provider. I've been there 16 years. I've kind of done a bunch of different stuff. I actually came out of designing Wi-Fi, so that was my job for a long time. I then became a technical architect, so I kind of dealt with how we did our services. And then the last couple of years, I've been focused on automation and programmability. And really, my main thing that I do is I try to drive that all back into our services practices. So we have all these consultants that help look for the Wi-Fi access point that's probably in a ceiling around here. Go do these jobs every day at businesses all over the country. And some of them write scripts and make their lives easier. Some of them don't. And we're trying to get everyone to do that. I also talk to our legal folks, so try to create policy, understand things like open source. And then a lot of what I do, sort of what I'm talking about today and what was inspired is like there's actual things that we need tooling for. So I try to actually build stuff as well. I got a bunch of certifications. I've done a couple of things with some open source projects. I've had some weird experiences, like I did a bunch of NFL, NHL, Wi-Fi stuff. I did a Super Bowl. And I volunteer, and I'm the Wi-Fi lead for the DevCon and ThoughtCon Hacker Conference. So yeah, a little bit of everything. Okay, so we're going to talk about developing in dev containers, but I realized that if you don't know what a dev container is, we have to start there. So what is a dev container? And I'm just using the spec information off of Microsoft's site because it is a Microsoft spec, although it is open. It is an open specification for enriching containers with development-specific content and settings. So basically, we're sitting on top of some sort of container backend, Docker, Podman, etc., and we're building a spec to say, this is what I want in my development environment. So I wasn't sure where to put this slide, but let's talk about the advantages before we kind of get into the meat of it. With this as a spec that you're putting near your code, you get a lot of things. You get environment consistency. It's really quick to onboard someone. If I have this in my repo and I have a junior dev or a new dev, it's already there. They can just build the environment right in their desktop. There's isolation because it's in a Docker sort of backend. I really enjoy the idea of codification of intent. So I want something to work this way. I want these tools installed. I want these ports open, whatever it is in that spec file. So if you decided, I don't want to use your crappy dev container, I want to do my own thing, you could go and read that intent and kind of figure out what I'm telling you I want. What I really like is I'll say automagic volume mounting. So if you've ever done stuff with containers, you know that sometimes you got to move things around and have things inside and outside the container. And the dev container spec kind of does a really good job of doing a lot of that for you. And then there's all the extensions of, I want to do extra stuff with volume mounts that you can do as well. It is cross-platform, and you can use it with remote development. Okay, so what do you need for the dev container? We talked about the spec, so you need usually a devcontainer.json file. There's tons of examples out there. You can build your own. We'll go into that in a little bit. You need a runtime. So you need Docker, Podman, Moby. Docker desktop is not for everyone these days. Like I cannot use it because I am in a large corporate environment. So IT is not going to pay for thousands of us to have Docker desktop. So there's also Podman desktop and Rancher desktop, which give you that backend that makes it easy enough to use if you're not familiar. And then you need some way to launch this. And there's a bunch of different ways. You can use regular sort of IDEs that you probably heard of, PyCharm, VS Code. NeoVim actually has a plugin if you still really love that Vim lifestyle. It works in code spaces. I don't know a lot of people that actually do dev work in code spaces, but if you do, you could just launch that right out of GitHub. And I think there's some more, but I have one IDE that I use, so that's kind of as far as I'll take it. All right, let's look at that environment spec a little bit. Honestly, image is the only requirement. You can build a dev container that says, I want this Docker image, go. Nothing else, you can go from there. But as you can see in the image, there's a lot of other stuff you can do if you want to add some stuff or configure it in a certain way. You can use local container files. So let's say the perfect image doesn't exist or you're working offline, you could build your own container spec, build that in advance, have that with you, and then run that as you want. So, there's a lot of flexibility, and this image doesn't have this exact thing that I need, or maybe you have something proprietary that you need to shove in a container. You can do that in advance and have the spec reference that locally and call it and start it. There's some neat like pre-boot, post-boot, first boot commands, and I'll show that in the demo as long as the demo doesn't like blow up on me. It allows you to do things like, hey, I'm starting this container, but once it's started, I want to do X, Y, and Z. Or after the container is started, I want to do A, B, and C. So you have a lot of flexibility in environments up and now do something. And then there's lots of customization. So because Microsoft wrote the spec, because VS Code is a Microsoft product, they have lots of good documentation on all of the things that VS Code can do within that spec file. A lot of the other IDEs support the same stuff, but it's not necessarily one-to-one, but there's a lot of extra stuff in there. All right, so I mentioned close to the code, right? The spec is going to live in a .devcontainer folder. That's at the root of your directory if you're using, a Git to source control. In that .devcontainer folder, you have a devcontainer JSON, and this is appropriate to check into your source. Obviously, you have to do regular hygiene things with like don't put secrets in your Docker containers, that kind of stuff. You don't really need to address that with this. That's just a general best practice. But you can have this in your Git repo. Someone else can pull it down and never touch it, never care about it. It's a couple lines of text. You don't need to worry about it if you don't want to use it. So I've been advocating, at least in our repos, I'm putting it in there, and if you don't want to use it, that's fine, but I want to make my life easier and let you make your life easier if you choose to follow me. All right, we kind of talked about the Docker thing. So I don't have any examples of Docker because I don't use Docker. 2022 was when that change happened, and you can still use it. I looked this up. Small business, startups, personal use, education and learning, students, instructors, non-commercial, open source development. I am none of these at work. In my own time, it's fine, but I just don't use Docker because of it. So we'll talk about what I do use. I'm using Rancher for the most part. I've noticed that at least on my machine, in my corporate environment build, Rancher Desktop has been very, very stable for me. It does its updates, it boots, it just kind of functions, and I don't need to worry about it. There's a couple of nice things in there that they offer. So that screenshot shows that you can run Kubernetes with it. I choose not to because I'm not running anything in Kubernetes on my machine. So I turn it off. I can also decide what engine I want to use. I'm choosing the Moby Dockerd engine so that I just have regular Docker commands in my shell rather than having to do nerd cuddle stuff for Kubernetes. And then the last thing that's nice, I'm on a Windows machine for my corporate thing. I have WSL, so Windows Subsystem for Linux, for a lot of my dev work. It's not necessary, but I like to use that. And I've got one-click options to dump the SOC stuff all the way into the WSL instance if I want to run Docker out of there. So I don't have to flip back to PowerShell to start up a Docker container. It's just ported through with one click. Rancher does all that stuff in the back. Kind of convenient. Podman I've been playing with a lot lately. I actually like Podman too. It's got a lot of knobs, and I think there's some better stuff in Podman Desktop than in Rancher, but it's not been super stable for me. They're moving a lot right now, which is good. I think they just recently had their first stable release, so it might get better. The big thing that I really like, and this is what's on the screenshot, is they show you what registries you're logged into. So again, thinking about, I'm corporate persona, right? We have GitHub, it's private. If I put containers up there and I need to pull them from GHCR, I have to log into that. And in my case, we're using two-factor and it's tied to our domains. So I have to use a PAT just to get in because everything else is done by SSH key. So if I forgot that I've logged in, or if I've logged in with a bad key or something, I don't know from my Rancher setup unless I do it in the command line and say, log out, log back in. With Podman, it's right there, and I can see what container registries I'm actually logged into. So like 1 point for them, but right now for me, that's not enough to make me say Podman Desktop is the way that I go. So if you think about the slide I had a couple back, we're sort of in those three pillars of spec, runtime, launch. So as far as launch, I'm a VS Code guy, so that's what I'm gonna show. For VS Code to get this working, you need their devcontainers extension. It's pretty simple for anything VS Code, you go browse for the extension or you go to Microsoft site, pull it in, it will install and make that available. It actually has, it being VS Code, a bunch of configuration templates to run dev containers for you. So if you use the command and select dev container, it gives you this giant dropdown. So that screenshot shows if I just wanted a Python environment, there's already one that Microsoft has built. It will pull the container, it will give me the environment, and it will have whatever Microsoft deem the ideal Python environment. So again, I prefer to build my own stuff because I don't know what they're doing, but you can just fire that up if you want to play around and don't want to try to figure out how to write a Docker spec. And then finally, I mentioned that a runtime is supported. In VS Code, you need to tell it what that one is. So right now, I have that extension set for Docker and Docker Compose because I'm using Rancher. If I was using Podman, I would have to say Podman Compose and Podman so that it could find the execution in the back end and have it in my path for VS Code to do all of its magic. Okay, so some cautionary tales. As probably anyone that's dealt with containers knows, it's not all sunshine and roses. The backend can be tricky, especially when you're dealing with WSL and Windows. It's a lot easier in Mac OS and Linux. You can, in WSL, actually install Podman or Docker directly in WSL, and it gets a little easier, but you have a little bit more trouble with volume mounting across, because now you're volume mounting into WSL versus in your Windows environment. That may be a problem for you, it may not. For what I'm using, because I'm trying to hand this to people that aren't as good with these utilities, I like to keep it on the Windows side so they can just go to their normal Windows file system and open this stuff up and execute. And VS Code moves a lot too. So as of recently, I was using, I'd say last week, Podman Desktop. Pushed an update, something broke. Podman Desktop is not working anymore. Every time I launch it, VS Code tells me, hey, you need to install Docker, even though I have the setting that said, no, you should be using Podman. So, you know, there's a certain level of, you need to be able to troubleshoot this stuff on your own. And as I mentioned, because of that, if you're not Docker, you might be a third-class citizen. It's just sort of like the documentation that's out there. I will say Podman does a good job. Rancher does a less good job about getting their stuff to work, but because it's just Dockerd on the back end, they kind of say, well, don't worry about it, it'll be fine. And I will say it has been for me for the most part. Okay, so that was a lot. Key takeaways from that. That spec, super flexible. Lots of examples out there. You can build your own custom stuff. You can really make it do whatever you want. There's a bunch of different runtimes you can use. Docker Desktop is the smoothest, and I did test it on my personal machine when I was having problems, and it just works. Like, you don't think about it at all. But I think Rancher Desktop is a good low maintenance one if you can't use Docker. And then front ends. So I think VS Code, obviously being a Microsoft product, is doing the best job. And there's lots of examples from Microsoft on how to run that. But, you know, if you're already going to get your hands in here and like play around with NeoVim, it's out there, and, you know, give it a shot. All right, so on to the actual use case. How am I doing on time? I feel like I'm going pretty fast. I want to talk about Ansible because that's what I've been working on lately, which is funny because was it like last October I did a talk, maybe 2 years? I also talked about Ansible because that's what I was working on at the time. In between, I did a bunch of other stuff. I swear it's not only Ansible. So when we're talking about Ansible, there are challenges in just getting Ansible installed. So how do you install Ansible? Well, maybe you do it with a package manager. Maybe you're doing it with pipex. You're probably in a virtual environment if you're just installing with Python, but maybe you're not. Maybe you're doing it in a remote environment. I know people that spin up a whole virtual machine with VMware to do anything that I'm asking them to do, which is ludicrous. So if I ask one of my constituents or one of my delivery engineers, I want you to install Ansible, I've got 10 different ways they can do it, and I guarantee you they're not going to do it the way that I expect them to do. Because I'm on the side doing the development, there are all sorts of interesting things about Ansible development and like how you set your environment up, where your path is. Currently, I'm working on an Ansible collection, and if you want to run Ansible test on it, it needs to be in /collections/org/collection name as your path. Otherwise, Ansible test won't run. So the development container I'm using I'm shunting in a stupid path so that the test just works right. I wouldn't expect anyone else to know how to do that right off the bat, so I've got it codified in my dev container, so I don't have to think about it. There's also code signing, like you can code sign your Ansible stuff. So do you want to deal with installing PGP, GPG? I don't, but it's all going to sit there in that environment if you need to do something like that. And then I think about sort of personas for the folks that I deal with, where I'm developer persona, but most of my other folks are end user personas, and they may have no idea what the heck all of this stuff is, but it doesn't really matter. If I can ship them a couple playbooks, this flat file, and tell them to run it in VS Code, and they'll just have the environment work magically, that's great. I can make them dangerous enough to use what I built for them and hope that they don't break it horribly, but they don't need to understand all of this stuff. It kind of puts a nice sheen on a bunch of complicated stuff in the back end. And less platform problems. So like I said, Windows machine, I deal with people that have Mac OS. I know one guy, actually he was the one that gave me the Ansible talk with me, who is using Red Hat products at work, but like the rest of my company doesn't. The last thing, if you're familiar with Ansible at all, you probably are running Ansible core. Ansible had a product called Tower, and then is now called AAP, or Ansible Automation Platform. So this is Red Hat / IBM's money-making machine for the back of Ansible. It's totally different. You need several servers to get it running. It is their paid product to automate your entire environment. And so it looks and feels a little bit different. The benefit here is that if you're using a dev container, you can still build things that you can either run with core, or you can throw over to AAP to run as an execution environment, and it'll just deal with it fine. So I don't touch that much. Like I said, my colleague Tim that spoke with me last time, he's on the side of the business that does that work. But this sort of environment that's built for Ansible development works on both sides. We don't have to create bespoke environments again. Okay, so how are we solving that with the dev container stuff? Ansible has this thing called Ansible Development Tools. It's actually a Python package, so you can install that, and all of these things will come with it. The important things for us as developers are, you need core, obviously, the linter, builder, potentially if you're building a collection, but you don't 100% need it, PyTest Ansible, maybe Molecule if you're using their molecule testing. And then they like Tox when you use their templating to run everything. So if you didn't know that, you may not know to install all of those things. And again, if I'm telling another developer, I need you to have this, but I don't care about that, it can get a little complicated. So that is a Python package. However, they have the opinionated dev container for that package and all of the other stuff in the environment. The other nice thing with that, and that's the actual spec for it. So like I said, you need one line, but this is the spec to build their container for that development environment. You could also use that container as a base layer. So again, I'm talking about Docker. If you understand Docker, I could start with their environment and then say, I want to layer on this other stuff that I have that's proprietary, and I'm shoving it in later. They've got Podman and Docker versions in this repo. So the Podman version looks slightly different with the way that they do some of the volume mounting, some of the other features, because Podman can run rootless, Docker cannot. Let's see. They have a Codespaces version, which all they do is change the name, which I think it's funny that they publish that with just like, this says Codespaces, this says Docker. And then these will work in AAP as execution environments. So like the big thing about AAP is you say, I want to do this thing that's it's codified in YAML, right? Do these things. What AAP allows you to do is say, here's the execution environment I want that to run in, and it will spin up a container for you, execute it, and then give you all that stuff back in their front end. So if I'm using this, I can also say, well, just, I built this, I tweaked it, now I can hand it over to that big mess of servers to let that run my workload. The link at the bottom is read the docs to that container, and has some more interesting stuff there. But really, what you're looking at on the right, that's it. That's the spec. Okay. Before I hit the demo, Are there any questions? Because I ripped through a bunch of stuff. And it's probably hard to understand it if you've never seen it.
Would you ever use a dev container to build a Docker image that would be published, or would you still like publish to a registry, or would you still use like regular Docker to do that?
I probably would, mostly because I think one of the benefits here, and you'll kind of see it in the demo, is I like living in the IDE for everything. And because I can then have that fire up what I need. And the Podman one actually supports Podman in Podman. So I could also determine what I want and build another container, have it launch the container and get into the container and test. So I wouldn't say it replaces it, but I wouldn't hesitate from using it to do that. Just so I don't have to bounce around in different systems.
So the dev container is only purpose is just like development, and you recommend that best replacement is Rancher. Like, what is Rancher?
So Rancher is a Kubernetes and Docker basically front end.
Okay.
It's an OpenSUSE thing. So if you can't run Docker desktop, again, anyone can run Docker, but Docker desktop is the GUI friendly product. Rancher desktop could do essentially the same thing with a different container backend. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, and dev containers, the only purpose is really just to help developers. Right?
Well, so I also use them as execution environments, and that's one of the other things. So for me, it's development, but for the people that I'm handing the Ansible stuff to, it's an execution environment. So I can get them to install all my dependencies, any other services I need, any other niceties, and the dev container spec will do all of that for them because it's codified.
So it's like also one level above like a container.
Yeah,
spec.
pretty much. It's sort of just a nice fascia on a container, really.
Okay, basic question. What is Ansible? Why would somebody want it?
I should have started there. So Ansible is and it's written in Python, so that's why I'm kind of saying, this is still a Python talk. Ansible is, I should really just pull up their definition. Let's see what Google says. It is effectively, there we go, open source IT engine that automates application deployment, cloud provisioning, and other IT tasks. Ansible's been stretched in a lot of ways. So it was probably originally infrastructure automation and deployment, and it's agentless, so it basically connects out, and then on the remote machines, it would run Python to do the things. You could also run it locally and have Python do the things. When you run it against cloud endpoints, it usually runs locally on your machine, uses Python to do the cloud things. So it is a way to state intent, all done in YAML, and then there are various plugins and collections that you can add on that vendors and community have written to automate specific things. So I want to do stuff to a Linux box, or I want to go do something to Azure. Or in my case, what we're working on right now is Cisco's Meraki product. So they have released their own collection that it's essentially an Ansible wrapper around their API that says, anything we do with our API, you can have Ansible execute that for me. Answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so let's get in the demo.
Hey.
Yes, Weasel.
So, Rancher, you said that's an OpenSUSE thing? Does
Yes.
it exist in other
Distros?
distros?
I haven't installed desktop on anything other than Windows and Mac OS. So I don't know if the desktop does. I presume it does, but I don't know. Is that
I was just curious if it was it was specific to like vendors or more of a community thing.
I do not know the answer to that question. I can see if I can figure it out. I have someone else that's a little bit more up
I can
on it.
also look it up.
Yeah.
I was just curious.
Yep. Sorry, don't know off the top of my head. Okay, so this is a very, very simple folder, and it's really to show the dev container and the experience. First, we'll go into the JSON dev container. You'll notice it looks very much like that last screenshot because I basically copy pasted it, but I added one thing. So I mentioned that there's other things that you can do, and specifically Microsoft supports a lot of these extra things. I added in a on create, and then I gave it a path to a shell script that's sitting right next to devcontainer.
Can you zoom?
Yes. Can I zoom? Let's see. Oops. Remember that, there we go.
Is that what plus?
A little better. I can go one more. How's that?
Very good.
Okay.
Much better.
All right, so this on create command, as I was mentioning, will effectively run when the container is created. I have a couple extra things that I decided I wanted to do in this environment. So I created a simple shell script. Again, it lives in that dev container. You can put it somewhere else in the path. But all it does is it installs, like I said, I've been working with Meraki's Ansible collection. They require their own SDK installed. So I have to pip install that. And that looks a little funny because I'm in a Docker environment. So I'm just using -u and sort of, closing my eyes to the whole idea that it's not in a virtual environment. And then I'm going to use Ansible's Galaxy command to install cisco.meraki, which is their collection name. I could do that manually. It would work fine, but I just wanted to show that, if you have some other setup things, you can just have it do that for you. Joe, do you have some?
Does that run inside the container or on the host?
Inside the container. There are things that you can run outside. The ability to do stuff with the dev container spec is pretty wide. So if you had stuff you want to run inside, when the container is built, after the container is built, on the outside, it's got hooks for a lot of that stuff. So if you've got a complicated setup, I think it could probably handle it mostly. Okay, so my spec is there. It's old garbage. And then I've got a simple, so if you've never used Ansible before, this is what an Ansible playlist would look like. I'm basically having it gather the facts about the machine, and then I'm going to lazily run a shell command that says, hey, show me what I have installed via Ansible Galaxy, because in theory, my shell script should install that and it should be there when I get there. VS Code here is complaining because it says that I don't have any of these things, because I don't. I'm outside the container right now. One thing of note, Windows will not run Ansible. You have to run Ansible within WSL or on Mac OS. So as a Windows user, I cannot run Ansible bare on this machine. I have to find another way to do it. So again, that's where the execution environment part comes in, that I can run that because it's in a container. So let's cross our fingers that this doesn't blow up on me. I'm going to reopen in container in VS Code. Where I will add it to the workspace. I should have been asked that. Hold on, let's see. I might need to rebuild. Actually, before I do this, let me verify that I actually have Docker running properly. I do. Okay, good. All right, so let's see. Dev container. I'll rebuild and reopen. I don't know why it's asking me for that. I didn't get hosed by another update here.
Pick one.
Try one more time. So I had not seen that prompt before. Didn't do my sacrifice to the demo gods, so this is my own fault. Usually, VS Code will actually prompt you as well. It says, hey, I noticed that you've got a dev container. I think that's my problem, is I'm not in the right directory. I was a directory up, so if I actually open this in the Git repository, it will recognize that top level path with .devcontainer, and it should pretty much immediately say, hey, I see that there's a dev container spec here. Do you want to reopen it as a container? Otherwise, the command that I was just running would suffice as well. Let me just see if that extension loads and prompts me. You don't always want to rely on that, but it is sort of nice that it'll ask. All right, it's not asking. I ran out of disk space earlier today, so it's been a fun day with containers and, swearing at my IT in my mind because they give us
Happened to me a lot with
small disks.
containers.
Yeah, well, and yeah, when you're sitting around most of the morning and playing with containers, you end up with a couple extra gigs of stuff you don't really need. All right,
Just do it activating container plugins, extensions. So.
there we go. Okay, so there's that nice little prompt. It says, hey, I see that that's there. Do you want to reopen? Sure I do. And then it basically treats this as a remote. I like to watch the log to see if it's going to blow up, but you can basically see it's going to do that build. I believe I already had the container image cached because I didn't really want to pull it down, not knowing what the Wi-Fi was going to be here. But it should be reading that and doing the build based on the spec. I didn't point this out. I can show you in a second when it reopens. One of the neat things about the VS Code part of the spec is that you can tell it what extensions you want. So like I have the Ansible extension listed in the spec so that when it pops open, it installs the Ansible extension because it makes sense. I'm doing Ansible dev work. But if you have linters or anything else that you're using in VS Code with extensions, you can just tell it to do that and then it'll be ready in your environment once it comes up. All right, we're looking like we're pretty much there. Okay, so this last bit was running the shell script. So you can see that it went and did my pip install and then it did the Ansible Galaxy install. So now I have my execution environment. You see at the bottom, I'm in my dev container, but this looks essentially the same. The interesting thing here too is the volume mapping should just work. So if I create test text and put in a dummy thing, if I go back to my Windows side and I just open up Windows Explorer, so I see the file path, I get that file. It's already volume mapped out for me. I can open it up. Nothing is going to complain. One of the interesting things is the way that this gets mapped. It will, oops, that's what I wanted. The file permissions are strange on the Windows container side. On other systems, it will behave nicely, and you can actually change things in the spec. So let's say you have a container and you have user ID 3000. If you want that to be the user that you're coming in, you just define it in the spec like you would in a regular Docker container, and Mac OS and Linux will handle that appropriately and do the mapping back and forth so that you get the right file permissions and ownership on either side, regardless of what you're doing. Windows is just like everyone can read and write because Windows is dumb and it doesn't know about these file permissions. All right, so let's see. Oh, I get a terminal open. It's actually got a default terminal. Sorry, I'm too spoiled with being used to that. Okay, so I believe this gives us Z shell by default. Again, I don't have that installed. That's what their decision, being Ansible community for a shell. It also has auto completion because of some of the packages that got installed, which is really nice. So if I want to Ansible tab, it'll tell me all of the Ansible stuff that I've got. I think that's largely Z shell doing that. But again, all the niceties that I don't need to care about are there. I will, since I should have the Ansible extension installed, what I'll do here is I will actually use the extension to run my playbook right out of here. And it's going to run Ansible-playbook with the file that I have open. The first set was a gathering of facts, so all the specs for this machine. It's pretty verbose because it's got a lot of information in there. The thing that we care about really is the proof that the two items that I asked for it to install in my onCreate command, being the Meraki package and the collection, my hacky example was running the shell command to do the Ansible Galaxy collection list. This is the output of that, and then we can see right up at the top there that my Cisco Meraki collection was installed. I did not install that. It came in because I specified it in the spec. And then if I want to, I can also do pip lists, and I'll look for Meraki, and that should be there as well. Yep, sure is. So that's pretty much the demo. Like I said, the nice thing is I'm still in the same IDE. I can play with the files on the Windows side if I need to. They get translated over into the other side. So if I was handing this over to someone as basically an environment that they want to run something in, they just need to have it in their folder. Like if they wrote an Ansible playbook, it could live on the Windows side. They could execute this, and then they could run it without ever really having to think too hard about where that was running. How am I on time, Joe?
You're okay.
Any questions on the demo?
That VS Code is running inside the container, basically, right? Or kind of,
Yes,
Remote.
it's VS Code's remote, so it shunted itself in there and then it made that connection. So I have my front end VS Code running, but it is communicating to code on the back end like you would on an SSH host or anything else.
when you distribute that, do you, like to your users, do they, like you tell them to use VS Code or their runtime of choice? Or is there some like execution you can do without VS Code?
I basically tell them to use VS Code because it's sort of the easiest to get them to install and troubleshoot. I'm not at the point where I've actually got our IT group to like install things for me, but ideally I'd love to say, hey, get Rancher on everyone's machine and get VS Code on everyone's machine, and then I don't have to think about it, but I'm not there yet. Question in the back?
Yeah. Have you run into any issues with extensions? Like I didn't know like the feature that you could request it to install it. Have you run into any issues with them, like after requesting to installing and doing something that it doesn't always work?
So the question was, have I run into any issues with extensions? I have not seen any. It's been pretty good. I'm pretty light on extensions. I don't go super heavy. And with the dev containers, I try to pick the extensions that I care about for that environment and not, I've had problems where I have like 30 extensions installed and something doesn't like something else. So for these, I try to keep it close to what I'm developing against and the things that I care about at that time. I have seen some interesting things with like corporate proxies that sometimes things get weird because, corporate says, well, you're going through whatever. We use Zscaler, so everything goes through Zscaler, and I've had some things get strange or VPNs where it's not necessarily the container, it's not necessarily VS Code, it's that you sort of don't see that layer of the network doesn't do what you're expecting it to do. Any other questions? Okay, so just a couple more slides and we'll round it out. I talked about Ansible, but really this could be used for anything. So I kind of rebuilt that slide saying, hey, maybe you're doing this with Python because this is ChiPy after all. Same thing, package manager, pipex, how are you installing stuff in Python, right? If you build this environment, especially for development, you get to tell them how you want to do it. You can codify it, it runs the way you want, and you don't let someone interpret maybe what you said. Again, that junior developer, new developer, I'm handing you this thing, or you're just cloning the repo and running it, it's all going to be there for you. That consumer access, that persona that I was talking about, again, non-experts hopefully will have an easier time, and I'm hand waving a little bit that there's a bunch of containers under there. That makes it not necessarily easy when they break, but if it all works great, it's an easier time. And then the last thing is, it's just a Docker container. So if your development environment requires extra stuff, like maybe you need a web server, maybe you need some sort of mocked out database for whatever you're testing against. You could build all that stuff and codify it and have the dev container spin it up locally if you're not trying to use cloud resources or something else on the network. It can build all that stuff because it's just a Linux box. So you could put that all in your dev container and then have your workflow work all on your machine out of that thing with whatever weird extra bit that you need. All right, my summary. So I think dev containers are a great way to build and share consistent environments. There is a little complexity in that setup, as you've seen, but once you've got it, that pattern is super flexible and you can just sort of reuse it in a lot of places. I think there's a lot of value in handing stuff to newcomers that makes it easier for them. And then I really like living in the IDE. So using that as sort of front end of I develop here, I execute here, I can play with different settings. I can make it look differently, but I'm not moving out of that IDE. Is easier on my brain, so I'm a big fan of that. All right, thank you very much. I've got a couple resources that you probably don't have time to jot down. I put that stupid little dev container up on my work GitHub. I can figure out how to get this somewhere though, so. Any last questions? Yes.
So at some point you mentioned container and container. Is that smooth, or have you found weird stuff with that?
I think Podman does a better job of it than Docker does because it was built to do that. That works pretty well. I haven't gotten really crazy with it. When you do it with Docker, you have to think about a lot of other things, and that's usually where it's not smooth. But I believe, let's see if I'm a liar. Podman run hello world. So I'm in my container right now, right? And in theory, I can run another container in my container. So that is because that specific container has Podman installed and they're doing all the plumbing right. So it does work pretty well. I don't like doing it in Docker though. Any other questions?
My experience a few years ago was that getting in GPU access in a container is very difficult. Has that changed?
I don't know about GPU. I have done mostly like serial devices, simpler hardware. I haven't played with the GPU. Honestly, don't know.
Okay, appreciate it.
I'm sure there's NVIDIA has documentation.
Yeah, do that.
It is, yeah, I think.
So consensus maybe yes. Joe?
Can you use like if you have an existing Docker Compose thing for your project?
Yep. All the spec supports Compose stuff. So yeah, you can also kind of take what you've got and wrap it around this to just have it run. I haven't done a ton with Compose though with dev containers, but it's in the spec, it's documented, so I assume that it should work. Any other questions? Okay, thanks for the time, everyone.
I think it has some